If you've been paying any attention to college football in 2025, you know that Indiana is the team to beat. Indiana has been absolutely unstoppable so far this season and has managed to overcome every single obstacle in its way. The school also managed to produce a Heisman Trophy winner in the process. Now, this is a pretty rare occurrence. In fact, most of you likely don't remember the last time Indiana had a good college football team at all. Now, as you can probably tell, I kind of made a mistake when I scheduled how I was going to do this. I'm making this video right before the national championship game is played. In fact, it's tonight. Gives you an idea of how far in advance I'm making these. Anyway, if Miami ends up winning the national championship, this video is going to look pretty foolish. But regardless of the final result, it is still true that Indiana has had its best football season at least since 1945. And just about nobody in the media is talking about that 1945 Indiana team. So Indiana football dates back to the late 1880s, and the team wasn't really any good back then either. In fact, even Indiana's better seasons tended to be pretty bad. Back in the 1920s and 30s, it was pretty common to see Indiana near the bottom of the standings of the old Big Ten. Well, of course, this is back when the Big Ten had 10 teams. It's back when people involved in football could still count. But don't kid yourself into thinking that the sport was somehow more fair back then, or even that conferences were stronger or more capable back in those days. I've read a couple of articles that insinuate that, and it's never really been true. So, for example, back in 1938, Indiana had 1 win and 4 losses in the Big Ten. But remember, there were 9 other teams in the conference. They only played against half of their conference opponents. So to give you an example, on October 12, 1935, Michigan beat Indiana at home 7-0 on a fumble recovery in the end zone in the second quarter. The next season, on October 10, 1936, Indiana beat Michigan 14-3, and that game was played in Ann Arbor once again. Only 14,000 fans decided to brave the rain and show up for that one. The empty stands you can kind of make out in these pictures were apparently concerning to school officials. Indiana and Michigan wound up not meeting again in a football game until 1943. Of course, that's unthinkable today. These teams were in the same conference, and yet they went 7 years without playing against each other. And the thing that's even crazier than that is that Michigan played almost all of its games at home in those years. This is because Michigan Stadium can seat over 85,000 fans. And so opposing schools that usually had stadiums that could seat like maybe 20,000 fans would much rather play in Michigan Stadium because they had a better chance of getting more from the gate receipts even when they were the visiting team. So things were a lot different back in those days. Anyway, on November 6, 1943, Michigan beat Indiana at home easily, winning 23-6. But on September 30th, 1944, Indiana won, surprising just about everybody. Indiana wound up in the middle of the pack at the end of 1944, while Michigan finished the season ranked 8th, but it was pretty clear that this wasn't the Indiana team of old. Now, the most interesting thing about the 1945 Indiana Hoosiers football team is the players. Of course, this is back in the days before you had national rankings of high school football players and all that jazz, and so it was entirely possible that a non-traditional power school could suddenly wind up with some really legendary players. Bob Hernschmeyer, scoring against Michigan in this photo, was the big star of the 1944 Indiana team. Now, Hernschmeyer had joined the Navy and had received special permission to stay with Indiana for the 1944 season. In 1945, Hernschmeyer wound up playing for Navy and led them to a spectacular season, losing only to that invincible Army team. Hernschmeyer wound up playing professionally for a decade after that and was one of football's big early stars. Well, that's the way it was during World War II, at least. The great players would find themselves suddenly drafted or would enlist or something like that, and then all of a sudden they'd wind up playing for Army or Navy or one of the dozens of military camp teams that had popped up all over the country. Anyway, even though Hernschmeyer left, there were still a few bright stars on the Indiana team in 1945. For example, George Taliaferro became the first black man to lead the Big Ten in rushing in 1945. Taliaferro overcame horrific racism during his time at Indiana University, and he wound up with a successful professional career of his own. And then there was an end named Ted Kluszewski, who went on to be famous for other reasons. The Big Clue was scouted by the Cincinnati Reds in his college days and wound up becoming an all-star in professional baseball. Well, Indiana's first challenge in 1945 was a familiar one. It was yet another road game against the University of Michigan. As usual, the expectation was that Michigan would win the Big Ten. but it was Taliaferro's amazing running and Indiana's good blocking that wound up dictating this game. Indiana dominated on the ground and in the air, cruising to a 13-7 victory. Now, I have to warn you here, this is the only game that I've got game film for. I know that there are other 1945 Indiana football game films floating around out there, and this one kind of stinks because you can't really see most of the backfield before the snap. But you can also see some interesting things about what the game was like back in those days just from this film. So, for example, Michigan would come out in the old Notre Dame box, which was a shift into a modified single wing formation before every single play. And Michigan would occasionally call running plays out of one of these totally stacked formations. You just don't see stuff like this anymore. Trick formations like the single wing and its variants were actually considered orthodox back in those days. It had all been popularized by Carlisle back in the 1910s. Indiana's formation here is a bit more bizarre. The quarterback tended to leave right before the snap, letting the ball go straight to the fullback, who was the chief passer. It was like a modified T formation. And as you can see here, passing back then was just as effective as it is now. You can also find a few examples of Indiana running plays out of an old school T formation like this one. This is the sort of thing that wound up dominating college football in the late 40s and throughout the 1950s. So somewhere here on this channel, I've got a video about the single wing formation that you can check out if you want more of that history. Basically, it was around 1944, 1945 that they changed the passing rules to allow you to pass from any point behind the line of scrimmage. Before then, it was that you had to be 5 feet behind the line of, 5 yards behind the line of scrimmage to be able to throw a forward pass. Now that change made it so that the quarterback could take the snap up close without having any sort of like penalty, as in like not being able to pass at all. This actually wound up ushering in the modern era of football, and Indiana was a big part of it. Anyway, Indiana's victory over Michigan was sort of a mild shock to the football world. The game was actually pretty even when you look at the stats, but Indiana's superior field position won out. It was a hard-fought victory back in the old days of mud and dirt football. And that brought up the second game of the season, a road game against Northwestern. Now, nobody knew this at the time, but this one wound up being one of Indiana's most difficult games of the whole season. Northwestern had an awful season in 1944, winning only a single game. Still, this was a pretty big game in the national picture, and it received live radio coverage over NBC. Northwestern went up 7-0 at the end of the first quarter after a block punt. But it was a series of big runs by Ted Kluszewski with only a minute or so left that helped Indiana drive the field to set up the game-tying score. In the end, it was Pete Pijos, who had recently returned from service in the Army, who caught the game-tying touchdown pass. The result was a hard-fought 7-7 tie. Now, when you see those old box scores, you do need to remember that it was generally the case that 11 men were used in those games. There were substitutes, but it was rare and it was generally discouraged, even though the rules were allowing for more and more liberal substitution. Players were still expected to go both ways for the entire game, so it was a lot different back in those days. Anyway, the Hoosiers didn't really have much time to think about whether that tie was a blemish on their record, since they had to face Illinois the next week for their third straight road game. This time, Ben Raimondi threw a pass to Ted Kluszewski in the fourth quarter for the only score of the game. Indiana won the hard-fought game 6-0 and basically ended Illinois' dream of a potential Big Ten title. And the next week, in the home opener, Indiana demolished Nebraska 54-14. So this is around the time that football people around the country started discovering that something was going on in Indiana. That Michigan win got attention, but it was really that out-of-conference Nebraska win that really raised some eyebrows. Anyway, it was around this time that Indiana got attention from the AP poll and climbed up to number 8. I should probably note that the supposedly scientific Lichtenhaus poll had Indiana only at 14th. But I'm not entirely sure what the Lichtenhaus methodology was, and in hindsight it seems to have overrated a lot of these military clubs and academies and stuff in the mid-40s. And so for this video, I'm just going to stick with the AP poll. So while Iowa managed to score 20 against Indiana, the Hoosiers still won 52-20. And this was the sort of game where everything Indiana tried wound up working. That brought up a massive home game against Tulsa. This was a team that Indiana couldn't afford to underestimate. So Tulsa was in the old Missouri Valley Conference along with Oklahoma A&M, which we now know as Oklahoma State. Heading into this game, Tulsa was 5-0 and had only given up 7 points in all 5 games combined. This was back in the days when you would see teams that looked totally dominant, and Tulsa was giving off hints of that dominance. The Bloomington was invaded by a sizable contingent of Tulsa fans. In the end, Tulsa's star right tackle was disqualified in the first quarter after an unusually rough block. After being frustrated time and time again, Indiana managed to break free near the end of the second quarter on one of those hook and ladder type lateral plays. Tulsa managed to break up a fake punt from Indiana's end zone for a safety, but it couldn't score any more than those 2 points. It was another defensive classic and is probably evidence that there wasn't a huge discrepancy between the Big Ten and some of the lesser conferences. And honestly, it was all downhill from there. So Tulsa had been ranked 14th in the country, and Indiana went up to number 5 in the polls after this game. And then the opposition proved to be a little bit easier. Indiana demolished Cornell College, a small school in Mount Vernon, Iowa, 46-6 the next week. The Hoosiers then beat number 20 Minnesota, a conference rival, on November 10th by a commanding 49-0 margin. It was off to Pittsburgh, where Indiana defeated Pitt 19-0. And that set up the biggest game in school history. Well, the biggest game until last night's game, that is. Indiana played at home against arch-rival Purdue for all the marbles in the last game of the season. The hype around this game was serious, and there was radio coverage all throughout the Midwest. The big news, of course, was that a win would give Indiana a conference title. That would be the team's first in 46 years of trying. In the end, though, the game wasn't even close. Indiana won 26-0, and Purdue barely had even 100 yards of total offense. And that was it for the football playing, except for the bowl games, of course. And this is where things get a little bit weird. Undefeated and number 1 Army destroyed undefeated and number 2 Navy on December 1st, 32-13. So much for Bob Hernschmeyer. And of course, this is back when we didn't need an executive order to tell us that Army versus Navy was a big game. When the final AP poll was released on December 4th, Army and Navy were at numbers 1 and 2, and undefeated Alabama was at number 3, with Indiana at number 4. That caused Grantland Rice to bemoan the situation, claiming that the voters had no idea how hard Indiana's schedule really was. So it's true that Alabama didn't play against a single ranked team during the 1945 season, sure, but at the same time, it was still kind of hard to figure out how the various conferences compared back in those days. I mean, Indiana destroyed number 20 Minnesota and number 18 Purdue. That didn't give up any points to either one of those teams, but it also struggled against number 14 Tulsa, who were theoretically in a worse conference. And it also wound up with that tie against Northwestern team that only ended up winning 4 games all season. Anyway, in the end, the real shame is that Indiana didn't get the chance to test its strength in a bowl game. Alabama wound up being invited to the Rose Bowl, and for one reason or another, Indiana was locked out of the various bowl games that were played down in the South. Alabama wound up destroying 7-3 USC in the Rose Bowl, making its case for being one of the best teams in the country. Meanwhile, Indiana coach Bo McMillan was named Coach of the Year, but that was really the end of all the accolades. And Indiana then turned around and lost the first 2 games of the 1946 season, and things went back to the way that they once were. That was the end of Indiana's undefeated streak, and its 1945 season turned into mostly a trivia question, until now, that is. Anyway, regardless of what happened last night, remember I'm recording this before the game was even played, this year's Indiana team is absolutely the best in the history of the school. But that doesn't mean that the 1945 team didn't also give us a wild ride.